Good evening, I'm Dennis Ward, and this is Face to Face. Our guest this week is Marion Buller, who served as the Chief Commissioner of the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. In 1994, Buller became the first Indigenous woman appointed as a provincial court judge in British Columbia. She is a member of the Mistawahis Nahiawak, a Cree First Nation in Saskatchewan. In November of 2021, Buller was appointed as the next Chancellor of the University of Victoria. Commissioner, Chancellor Buller, great to have you with us this week.
Thank you, Dennis. I'm happy to be here.
Congrats on your new role as the Chancellor at the University of Victoria. Can you tell us a bit about that role?
The Chancellor of a university in British Columbia, especially at UVic, is sort of the Governor General of the university. I'm in charge of all of the graduation ceremonies, all the convocations. I also have a seat on the Board of Governors and a seat on the Senate. So it's quite an active role and the opportunity to do a lot of good.
Busy role for sure, but a little more laid back, I guess, than acting as Chief Commissioner of a National Inquiry?
A little bit more laid back and a lot less travel, thank you.
You acted as, of course, the Chief Commissioner of the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls for 3 years. A heavy job, no doubt. Did you need time, I guess, after that final report was released to take some time for yourself?
Well, thanks for asking, Dennis. Yes, I did take the rest of the summer of 2019 off. I stayed home. I did some work around my house, so reacquainted with friends and family, and then back to practicing law.
3 years, as you mentioned, pretty much entirely on the road and listening to really difficult truths from families. It must have been a pretty difficult couple of years.
Dennis, it was difficult in a lot of different respects. The travel was difficult, but you get used to it after a while. I think that the difficult part for me was seeing the amount of work that had to be done, and done really well, and done properly, in an extraordinarily short period of time.
And we're going to talk about that time. Going back to the beginning of the inquiry, and things kind of got off to a rocky start with delays, one of the commissioners resigning, incredible expectations. Was that all difficult to navigate and to try and keep things on track?
The startup was difficult, and I'll tell you why. The commissioners and I started on September 1st, 2016, with our own cell phones and our own Gmail accounts. We had no offices. We had no staff. And it took us 9 months to get all the offices up and running and get all the staff online. And we had to borrow people from the federal government and from other places just to get up and rolling. The federal government was not at all ready for the work that we had to do and to help us do it. So not only were we, I think the expression was building the bus, riding in the bus, and driving the bus all at the same time, or something like that. And it was very hard work. The subject matter was very difficult. The hearings, getting them up and running, was very difficult as well. But I have to say, kudos, shout outs, big hugs to the National Inquiry staff who really made it happen, and wouldn't have happened in such a good way without them.
Did that kind of come as a shock to you? I mean, there'd been calls for maybe a decade at least for a National Inquiry to come on, to start one up, and to not have an office, be using your own phones, really unprepared here.
There was a part of me, Dennis, that was surprised about the lack of preparation on the part of the federal government, because they had been doing the pre-inquiry process. They had budgeted for this national inquiry. They had done a lot of preparation work. And so I was somewhat surprised, but then I wasn't, because I had low expectations going in about what the support we would be having from the government.
Why did you have such low expectations?
Well, I've been a commission counsel on a public inquiry before. I've been a judge for several years. I was in private practice as a lawyer, and I knew what it takes to get something like this up and running, to hire people, to get offices open. And I just had this hunch, Dennis, that they wouldn't be ready for us. It was just this hunch, and I can't be scientific about it. It was entirely a hunch.
Did you feel it was an indication of how serious the federal government was actually taking this inquiry?
Yes. I think that if they were taking it more seriously, there would have been more advanced work to get us up and running. As it was, I took my vacation time from the court to start looking at office spaces in Vancouver. And that was just 3 weeks before we were due to start. So I think it just was an indication of the lack of high priority, if that's the right word, given to the national inquiry.
Yeah, you mentioned you'd worked on an inquiry before, and commissioners had wanted a 2-year extension to the 2-year mandate. An additional 6 months was granted, but by most accounts, and you would know better than I, 2 years was never going to be enough time. People have pointed to the inquiry into the fatal Elliott Lake Mall collapse as an example. That took more than 2 years. Did you feel that the timeline was unrealistic?
I knew the timeline was going to be very tight, Dennis. And so all the more importance to be able to walk into a staffed, properly resourced operation, because we had to hit the ground running, and I knew that. The difficulty, well, there were several, but the difficulty was there just wasn't this prep work. And in fairness, I have to say the people on the federal government side and Privy Council became really strong allies in terms of moving things forward for us. I think they were inexperienced. I think that they were not entirely clear of what their role was going to be, but we worked it out. And in the end, they were very strong allies in terms of getting our work done and moving forward. But it took that time. And I knew going in, I think we originally had 28 months. It was from 1st of September to the end of December of so it was just a little bit over 2 years. I don't remember the exact number now. And we lost 9 months because of the lack of resourcing at the beginning of our work. And that left us in a real time crunch.
You no doubt knew at the time, but thinking back now, what more would you have liked to have done with that 2-year extension?
Oh, Dennis, there were so many subject areas that we just skimmed over. The impact of man camps, for example, on Indigenous women and girls and 2S people's safety. Those are those large ATCO hut settlements that come up sort of overnight next door to mines and other resource extraction projects. We just barely skimmed the surface of human trafficking and how that impacts safety of Indigenous women and girls and 2S people. We needed to do a lot more work there, and the sort of how that butts up against the sex industry, organized crime, for example. We needed to do a lot of our own research in terms of what are the critical points at which safety for Indigenous women and girls and 2S people just disappears. How are people falling through the cracks, so to speak, or through the social safety net? We also needed to look at the impact of poverty and the importance of a guaranteed annual livable income. And we needed to do a lot more work about what's happening in Northern Canada. So I'm very proud of the work that we did do. I think it's amazing, but there's a lot more work that we could have done.
We're going to talk about the work, the final report, Commissioner. We just have to step aside for a quick break,
Sure.
and then we'll continue the conversation here on Face to Face with Commissioner Chancellor Marion Buller. Welcome back to Face to Face. Our guest this week is Marion Buller, who acted as the Chief Commissioner for the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. Commissioner Buller, before the break we were discussing some of the things you wished you could have looked into more had you been granted a longer extension. Looking back, were there other things that maybe fell outside of the parameters of the inquiry that you wish could have been looked into more?
Oh, it's a bit of a shopping list of areas that we wished we could have looked into more, especially the incarceration or over-incarceration of Indigenous women and girls. That was another area that, again, we just touched on. And, understanding how they got there would have been a really, would have benefited the work that we did do. We only touched on it again. But these are women and girls for that matter, and to us, people who have been incarcerated, have somehow survived violence in their own lives. Mm-hmm. So although we did hear from survivors of violence and incarcerated women, we needed to do more to learn from the survivors about what it took to get them out of that cycle of violence, because they had a lot to teach us.
We speak of the criticisms of the inquiry and some of the other issues that there were, but, I think when that final report came out, people were, really blown away. How would you describe the reaction to the final report and its 231 calls for justice?
Well, I just have to add a comment that one of the other commissioners made after the fact, that the media turned our work into it was some sort of reality show about who was still left on the island, rather than focusing on the work that we were doing. And I thought that was rather apt in hindsight. But, our final report, we knew it would be great. And we had a wonderful research team that helped us sort of behind the scenes as well. Dr. Corinne Duhamel is brilliant, and she led us through the whole final report process. Again, I'm very proud of the work that we did do. And I'd like to think that the voices of the family members, the voices of the survivors and the other witnesses that we heard from clearly came through in the work that we did do in our writing in the final report, because it really was about what the families, members, and survivors had to say, their truths. That's what our work was about. The final report has garnered attention internationally, perhaps even more than domestically. We've had feedback from South Africa, from Australia, New Zealand, various states in the United States, for example. I've had contact from international courts, for example, Organization of American States, United Nations bodies. All have shown interest in the work that we have done, perhaps, as I say, more so than domestically. But, it's a really hard topic, Dennis. It's not a light, fluffy kind of friendly topic. This is hard stuff. Mm-hmm. And to use the word genocide was a decision the commissioners and I made with purpose. We knew we couldn't avoid that conclusion, and we could not avoid using that word. And people just don't want to hear it.
And that's what I wanted to ask you about, Commissioner. There was a lot of fallout, of course, when the report was released because of the use of the word genocide, despite there being a separate 45-page document outlining why the word was used. I guess, had you and the commissioners anticipated that backlash would be coming?
We knew there'd be pushback. In fact, I said to myself on the day that we had our formal release that we better do a lot of smudging because there's going to be a lot of bad medicine thrown out at us. And there was a lot of pushback. Yeah. There was a lot of misquoting, very superficial commentary by people who hadn't even read the executive summary. And I knew that would happen. The commissioners and I, the staff, we all knew that there would be pushback, and we would just have to weather that storm.
Weathered it well, I would say. The final report was 3 years in the making. This June will mark 3 years since its release. Has enough been done in the last 3 years to address those calls for justice? Short answer, no. Of course not. There hasn't been. And now, I have to say there have been some bright lights in responses to our final report. Yukon, for example, has done a wonderful job of developing their own implementation plan. Same with the NWT. Across Canada, at the grassroots level, there's been a lot of work done to push for implementation of our calls for justice. There are coalitions, there are women's organizations all across Canada, partnerships being built, for example, between women's organizations and policing, or between women's organizations and provincial governments. The federal government has fallen flat on its face. We don't have an implementation plan. There hasn't been any sort of cohesive statement on the part of the federal government about what it plans to do. There's no looking forward. If there is an implementation plan, I don't know about it, and they're keeping it quiet. But they have quite literally fallen flat on their face in terms of their responses. I'm glad you pointed out some of the other, organizations and stuff, because I was going to ask you, because this isn't just the federal government. These are recommendations for provincial governments, organizations, and everyday citizens. You feel some of those organizations, people are standing up and acting on these calls for justice? Well, some of the greatest experiences I've had have actually been with individuals or private organizations who have said, we really want to do something. Where do we start? How do we get the ball rolling? And a lot of those people have been non-Indigenous allies who really want to move the government forward, or all governments forward for that matter. And so it's a matter of just walking them through the calls for justice that all Canadians can act on. And if it's an organization, for example, of, let's say a teacher's organization, what can they do to change their curriculum? What can they do to educate themselves about the true history of Canada? So there's been a lot of interest, a lot of people who are wanting change, and the nice thing is they vote. Well, that all said, do you anticipate action coming from the federal government on this national action plan anytime soon? Dennis, I don't know what to expect. There's no clear communication from the federal government one way or the other about what they're doing. They are announcing funding for certain projects, but I thought it was put really well by someone in social media that all they're doing is putting out fires that they themselves caused by allocating this type of funding. So there's no cohesive approach that I know of. There may be. I just don't know about it. Yeah, you'd think you'd be one of the first to know. Commissioner, more to talk about here. We do just have to step aside and take one more quick break, and then we'll continue the conversation here on Face to Face with the Chief Commissioner of the National Inquiry for Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls, Marion Buller. Welcome back to Face to Face. We're sitting down this week with Marion Buller, the Chief Commissioner of the National Inquiry into Missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. And Commissioner Buller, I'm not sure if you're aware, but in the last 2 weeks, APTN Investigates, our colleagues there, have been doing an investigation on missing and murdered Indigenous men, and they found that there were at least 600 cases, at least, in Canada since 1974. Some family members are calling for an inquiry. Is that warranted, do you think?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't know. Is my short answer. I don't know what good it would do in terms of change, because the governments are very reluctant or very slow to make changes and implement our calls for justice, plus the calls to action for the TRC. What benefit it does have is it gives family members some closure, or the goal is to give them some closure. I don't know. I don't know is the short answer. But if it does go ahead, I hope that family members do obtain some healing, some closure in the process, and the recommendations are acted upon.
Commissioner, if you were to Google MMIW today, most of the stories that would come up would be from south of the medicine line, where there's a lot that seems to be going on there. Have people been reaching out to you in terms of what's been happening in the U.S. and their efforts there?
Yes, I have heard from several organizations, task forces, sorts of inquiries in the United States and they have questions about the work that we did do. Generally speaking, though, the work that they're doing is more data-oriented, less public hearing-oriented. Their terms of reference are far narrower than the work that we did do. But they've been very interested in data collection, statistics, that sort of thing from the work that we did do.
You know, as maybe it's too early to talk about this, but it's been over 5-6 years since things have been going on. What do you hope is do you think the legacy of this national inquiry will be?
Well, the legacy, I hope, is an acknowledgement, as the Prime Minister already did, of the historic and ongoing genocide against Indigenous women and girls and 2S people. I think if we remember the national inquiry for nothing else than the word genocide, I'd be happy. But I have to add to that, I just find it appalling that the federal government, through the Prime Minister, has admitted to the situation at least amounting to genocide, and yet they're allowing it to continue, and without any sort of responsibility. I just find it appalling that the genocide is continuing, because it is, and they're not being held accountable.
Yeah, continuing indeed. We just had a young lady murdered here in Winnipeg this past week. Commissioner Buller, we're out of time, but thank you for your time and for all the work you did over the years and the work we know you're going to continue to do on this. Appreciate you being with us this week.
Thank you so much. My pleasure.
That is all the time we have for this week. You can catch up on any episodes you may have missed by visiting our website, aptnnews.ca. And this episode and all of our past episodes are also available as podcasts. You can find those at aptnnews.ca/face-to-face podcast. I'm Dennis Ward. Thanks for being with us this week. Have a great night. We'll see you back here next week.